On Christmas Day, I sat quietly in the corner of my ex-husband's living room, surrounded by laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the sweet smell of roasted turkey. The house was full of guests, and my heart was already a little heavy. Holidays had always been complicated for me. Then, in front of everyone, my son Ethan stood tall, smiling proudly as he held out a set of shiny keys. "For you, Dad," he announced. David, my ex-husband, grinned like he had just won the lottery. It was a luxury car worth $30,000. The room erupted in cheers, everyone applauding the grand gesture. And then Ethan turned to me. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he had something special to share. Instead, he tossed a crumpled napkin onto my lap. Scribbled across it in messy black ink were 3 words: "Worst mom ever." The room laughed. Even David chuckled, as if it were a harmless joke. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I pressed that napkin against my chest. But inside, I felt my heart split open. In that moment, I wasn't just embarrassed, I was erased. Still, I stayed silent. I always did. But 1 week later, everything changed. Ethan called me, his voice breaking with tears. And that was the beginning of a truth none of us could ignore. I suppose before I go any further, I should tell you who I am, because otherwise, you might think I am just a bitter woman holding onto a napkin and a grudge. My name is Mary. I am 52 years old, and for the past 3 decades, I have been an elementary school teacher in a small town tucked somewhere between rolling hills and restless highways. My hair used to be the kind of chestnut brown that caught the sun in golden strands. But these days, silver streaks weave through it like threads of moonlight. My figure has grown a little slender over the years, partly from the long hours at school and partly from the endless days of doing everything alone. People say I have kind eyes, though I know there are fine lines drawn around them from the weight of sacrifice more than from laughter. And then there is Ethan, my son. He is 25 now, tall, handsome, the kind of man who turns heads when he walks into a room. To strangers, he is charming, always quick with a joke, always eager to shine. But to me, he is still the little boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee, who once slipped his small hand into mine and whispered that he never wanted me to let go. I raised him mostly by myself. That was not the plan, of course. His father, David, left when Ethan was only 8. One day, he was promising to be the man of the house, and the next he was gone, swept up in the arms of freedom and the smile of a younger woman. When Ethan was 15, David came back. Not back to us, not really, but back into Ethan's life. By then, I had already spent years stitching together every broken piece of our family, patching bills with late nights, covering tuition with double shifts, and holding Ethan's heart together with bedtime stories that promised him he was still loved. But when David reappeared, he returned with gifts, laughter, and an endless supply of charm. Suddenly, he was the fun parent. The one who took Ethan to baseball games, who never said no, who handed him pizza for breakfast and told him that rules were made to be broken. And me? I became the strict one. The voice that reminded him about homework, curfews, and responsibilities. It was not that I wanted to be the villain in my son's eyes. I only wanted him to grow strong, to have the kind of foundation that would hold him steady when life tried to knock him down. What Ethan never knew, and what I never told him, was that while his father dazzled him with big gestures, I was the one quietly paying his rent every month so he would not be evicted during college. I was the one who signed checks for his tuition, though he thought it was financial aid. I was the one who called the insurance company every year to renew his car coverage so he could drive without fear. I never told him any of it. I wanted him to feel independent. I wanted him to believe he was standing on his own 2 feet, not realizing that I was always just a shadow behind him, catching him every time he fell. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that silent love was enough, that a mother's quiet sacrifice did not need to be spoken, because one day he would just know. But as I sat in that crowded living room on Christmas Day, holding that crumpled napkin that declared me the worst mother ever, I realized how wrong I had been. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the tears I never let him see, all of it had disappeared into the background of his memory, replaced by the glow of his father's charm. David stood at the center of the room, soaking up the applause as if he had earned that $30,000 car Ethan had just given him. His arm was draped casually around Lisa, his partner, who was nearly 20 years younger than me. She was beautiful in that effortless, playful way, the kind of woman who tossed her hair and laughed like every moment was a secret joke. People loved her, just like they loved David. To the world, they were the picture of joy. But to me, they were a constant reminder that I had spent years doing the heavy lifting while someone else got all the credit. As I forced myself to smile in that room full of people, pretending the napkin was nothing more than a silly prank, I thought back to every late night I had worked to keep our lives afloat. The times I had packed Ethan's lunches while fighting back tears from exhaustion. The moments I skipped dinners so he could have enough. And still, I was the one holding the title of worst mom ever. I know now that it was not just about that napkin. That napkin was only the symbol, the sharp little dagger that revealed the truth I had been avoiding. Ethan did not see me. Not really. He saw a strict mother who made rules, who seemed to stand in the way of fun. He saw a woman who told him no when his father told him yes. He saw discipline where I hoped he would see love. And I will admit, as I drove home that night with the napkin clenched in my hand, I felt something inside me shift. The silence that had once been my greatest expression of love suddenly felt like a chain around my neck. For years, I thought I was protecting him by carrying the burdens alone. But now, all I felt was invisible. As I pulled into my driveway, the snow falling in soft sheets across the windshield, I whispered to myself a promise. I would not stay silent anymore. Silent love was not enough. If I was going to be painted as the villain in my own son's story, then I might as well be the kind of villain who finally told the truth. Christmas afternoon carries a kind of magic that can soften even the harshest winters. At least, that is what I used to believe when Ethan was little. Back then, Christmas meant pajamas patterned with reindeer, the two of us baking cookies that never quite held their shape, and stories whispered beneath the glow of a small tree that leaned to one side because we could never afford the perfect one. Those were the days when the joy came from being together, from love that had nothing to do with price tags or grand gestures. But this Christmas was different. This Christmas, in David's large and tastefully decorated house, everything felt staged, like a performance in which I had no meaningful role. The living room sparkled with twinkling lights that framed every window. Candles flickered on the mantel, casting soft shadows over the laughter that bounced across the walls. The smell of roasted turkey, heavy with herbs, mingled with the sweetness of cinnamon cider. Guests, dressed in holiday reds and greens, floated from one corner to another with glasses of wine, clinking in celebration. To anyone else, it must have felt like the perfect Christmas gathering. To me, it felt like stepping into someone else's life, a life where I had been written out of the script. I sat quietly on a floral armchair near the corner, a polite smile painted on my lips. My hands stayed folded neatly in my lap, though inside they trembled with nerves. My ex-husband, David, thrived in the center of it all. His voice carried easily, his laughter rich, his gestures confident. He had always been that way, the man who knew how to charm a crowd, who knew just what to say to make people lean closer. Beside him stood Lisa, young and glowing, her laughter like a bell that rang every few minutes, as though the world existed solely to entertain her. And then there was Ethan, my son, my pride, my heartbreak. 25 years old now, dressed in a tailored jacket that made him look older, more assured, though I could still see traces of the boy I once rocked to sleep. He stood with the kind of confidence that drew every eye in the room. Holding a small velvet box in his hand, he moved to the center where David was entertaining guests with yet another story about his so-called adventures. "For you, Dad," Ethan announced, his voice clear, loud enough to command attention. He handed over the box with both hands, a gesture filled with reverence. David opened it slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. When the keys inside gleamed beneath the chandelier's light, the room gasped. Murmurs turned into applause, and then applause swelled into whistles and cheers. Ethan smiled proudly, basking in the glow of admiration, his gaze fixed on his father like a worshiper at an altar. "It's a $30,000 car," Ethan declared, chest puffed, voice booming with pride. "Because you've been the role model who made me the man I am today." My heart clenched as though a fist had closed around it. A car worth more than my annual salary, gifted as though it were nothing. And those words, role model, the man who shaped him each syllable, landed like a stone hurled at me. I wanted to protest, to shout that I had been there all those years when David was absent, but my throat tightened until I could hardly breathe. The applause continued. David laughed, throwing his arm around Ethan, shaking the keys like trophies. "Well, son, you always did know how to surprise me," he boomed, his grin wide, his eyes shining with pride that felt stolen. Then, almost as an afterthought, Ethan turned toward me. He reached into his pocket casually, carelessly, and tossed something onto my lap. A napkin, crumpled, its corners damp from condensation. Scribbled in harsh black ink were 3 words: "Worst mom ever." For a moment, the room froze. Then laughter erupted first, a chuckle from David, then giggles from Lisa. Then the rest of the guests joined in, their voices blending into a cruel chorus. Someone even clapped sarcastically. I sat frozen, my fingers clutching the napkin, my face burning under the weight of every stare. I forced a smile, because what else could I do? I told myself not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction. My hands trembled as I folded the napkin neatly, pressing it flat against my lap as though it were some precious keepsake instead of an insult. Inside, however, I felt my heart splinter. It was not just humiliation, it was erasure. All those years of sacrifice had vanished into thin air, and what remained was this: a joke at my expense. The rest of the evening blurred into fragments. Plates clinking, forks scraping, bursts of laughter too loud, too sharp. Lisa leaning against David's arm, her smile bright as though she had already won some invisible contest. Ethan walking from guest to guest, receiving pats on the back, his pride swelling with every compliment. Not once did he glance my way. Not once did he notice how small I felt in that corner, shrinking into myself. When the night finally ended, I slipped out quietly, offering polite goodbyes no one truly heard. Snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the driveway in white. I slid into my car, shut the door, and let the silence wrap around me. The napkin sat in the passenger seat, a cruel companion. I picked it up, clutched it tight in my palm until the ink smeared onto my skin. Tears slipped down my cheeks, hot against the winter chill. As I drove home, the world outside blurred into streaks of white and gray. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale, while my chest ached with the weight of everything I could not say. For years, I had told myself that silent love was noble, that one day Ethan would see, would understand, would know. But that night I realized the truth. Silence had not built a bridge between us. It had built a wall. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked small and dark against the snow. Modest, humble, nothing like David's grand home. Yet it was within those walls that I had poured every ounce of my being into raising my son. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the quiet windows, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My reflection in the windshield looked tired, hollow, but behind my eyes something new flickered a quiet resolve. I stepped inside, placed the napkin on the kitchen counter, and stood staring at it. The words seemed to glow in the dim light, daring me to keep playing my role as the silent, invisible mother. I whispered to myself, "This will be the last time. The last time I let myself be erased. The last time I allowed my love to be taken for granted." A week passed. Ethan never called. No text, no message, no acknowledgement. The napkin remained on my counter, a daily reminder, a vow. At school, I went through the motions, teaching multiplication to children who still believed in magic. Their laughter echoed through the hallways, sweet and innocent, and I found myself aching for the days when Ethan's laughter sounded like that. The silence between us grew louder each day, filling every corner of my life. But beneath the ache, something else stirred a strength I had not felt in years. The version of me who quietly paid his rent, who bailed him out, who shielded him from every consequence, that version was fading. I began to prepare for the moment when Ethan would finally see the truth, not because I wanted revenge, but because I could no longer live erased. That Christmas napkin was no longer just an insult. It was a turning point. The week after Christmas stretched out longer than any week I can remember. Each morning, I woke to the sight of that napkin lying on my kitchen counter, a reminder of words my son had thought were nothing more than a joke. I left it there deliberately, as though forcing myself to stare at it would keep me from slipping back into old habits of silence. My house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears until it becomes unbearable. For years I had grown accustomed to Ethan's late-night footsteps or the sound of his laughter floating from his bedroom when he watched a movie. But now there was nothing. He did not call. He did not text. It was as though Christmas had erased me completely from his world. And yet, as much as it hurt, I told myself I had to stay strong. For once, I could not be the one to bridge the gap. So, I began to make changes. Quietly, methodically, I started untangling myself from the invisible web of support I had built around him. The first thing I did was call the rental company. I told them that beginning the next month, I would no longer be making payments for Ethan's apartment. My hands shook as I said the words, but there was a strange strength in my voice. The woman on the phone asked me if I was sure, if I wanted to leave him responsible. I told her yes, he needed to learn. Next came the car insurance. For years, I had renewed it without his knowledge, paying the bills out of my modest teacher's salary. This time, when the notice arrived, I set it aside. I could almost hear the sound of tires screeching, the panic that would follow when Ethan realized he could no longer drive without consequences. But I held firm. The hardest part was the credit card. I had co-signed it when he was a college freshman, telling myself that helping him build credit was another way of securing his future. I was the one who had been making the minimum payments whenever he overspent, convincing myself it was temporary. Now, I cut the cord. I called the bank and asked them to remove me from the account. The woman's voice on the other end warned me that Ethan would be left with the balance. My stomach twisted, but I told her it was time. At night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house. My chest ached with worry. What if he hated me forever? What if he saw this as proof that I really was the worst mom ever? But then another voice whispered inside me, "You have already given him everything. Let him see the truth." It did not take long for the consequences to unfold. One Thursday evening, as I was grading papers at the kitchen table, my phone rang. The sound startled me. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to see his name flash across the screen. Ethan's voice trembled when I answered. "Mom," he said, his tone stripped of its usual bravado. I don't know what to do. They kicked me out of my apartment. They actually put my stuff on the sidewalk, and the car it got towed because I couldn't pay the insurance. My friends saw it happen, and now it's all over social media. Everyone's laughing at me." His voice cracked. "I feel like such a failure." For a long moment, I said nothing. My throat tightened as I listened to him cry. Part of me wanted to rush in, to soothe him, to remind him that he would be okay. That was my instinct, the part of me that had carried him every step of the way since he was a boy. But another part of me, the part that had stared at that napkin for a week straight, knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. "Ethan," I said slowly, carefully, "go ask your father." There was a silence on the other end, stunned, as though he had not expected those words to come from me. "Dad?" he finally asked. "Yes," I said. "You gave him a car, remember? You told him he made you the man you are today. Ask him to help you now." The line went quiet. Then, after a few shallow breaths, Ethan hung up. I sat at the table staring at my phone, my heart pounding. The house felt even quieter than before. But this time, the silence was not empty, it was deliberate. For the first time in years, I had not rushed to save him. Later, I would learn what happened next. Ethan did go to David, desperate and broken, hoping for a lifeline. But David refused. He told him bluntly that he was old enough to handle his own problems, that he had his own responsibilities and could not bail him out. The same man who had smiled proudly as he received a $30,000 car on Christmas Day now turned his back when the consequences arrived. Word spread quickly, as things do in small towns and online communities. Ethan's eviction, his car being towed, it became gossip, a story shared with amusement. His friends whispered, his social media filled with comments that mocked him. For a boy who had lived so much of his life in the glow of admiration, the humiliation was unbearable. When I saw him again, his eyes were swollen, his voice hoarse from crying. For the first time in years, Ethan looked at me not as the villain, but as the one person who had truly been there all along. And yet, it was too late to erase what had already been done. The call from Ethan ended abruptly, but his broken voice lingered in my ears long after the phone went silent. I sat in the dim kitchen, papers scattered on the table, the clock ticking steadily on the wall. For the first time in many years, I had not run to pick up the pieces of his mistakes. My chest ached with the weight of restraint, but beneath that ache was also something else, an ember of strength that refused to burn out. The following days revealed truths Ethan had never imagined. Friends who once celebrated his flashy lifestyle now whispered behind his back. Pictures of his belongings piled on the sidewalk circulated online, paired with captions that mocked him. The car that had been towed became another cruel punchline. It was a fall from grace, played out in the harsh theater of public opinion, and for the first time, Ethan stood alone at the center of the stage. I did not call him. I did not rush to soften the blow. Instead, I waited. And sure enough, he came back to me, not as the proud man who had once tossed a napkin in my lap, but as a son stripped of illusions. He appeared at my doorstep late one night, his figure outlined in the glow of the porch light. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes were red from crying. When I opened the door, he stood there wordless for a long moment, the cold winter air swirling around him. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Mom," he whispered, almost like a child again. "I don't understand. Dad wouldn't help me. He said I'm an adult and it's my problem. How could he do that? I gave him everything I had." I looked at him carefully, my heart twisting. How I longed to take him in my arms and promise him that everything would be okay. But I remembered the napkin. I remembered the years of sacrifice he had never seen. And I remembered my vow. "Ethan," I said softly but firmly, "for the first time you are seeing clearly. Your father has always been the man who shows up for the fun, never the work. And my voice faltered, but I steadied it. "I have been the one behind the curtain, keeping your life from falling apart. You just never knew it." He blinked, confusion and pain flashing in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" So I told him. Piece by piece, I laid it bare. The rent I had been secretly paying for years, the tuition checks I had written without his knowledge, the car insurance I had quietly renewed, the credit card balances I had carried to keep him afloat. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled as I revealed the truth I had hidden for so long. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at me as though I had spoken in a foreign language. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked finally, his voice cracking. "Because I wanted you to believe you were standing on your own feet," I said. "I wanted you to feel strong, independent, like you were building your life by yourself. I thought silent love was enough, but I see now it only made me invisible." The words hung heavy in the air. Ethan lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumping. He did not argue, did not lash out. For the first time, he had no defense. But the road ahead was not easy. Ethan's humiliation became a story bigger than just the two of us. Rumors spread quickly. Parents at my school whispered in the hallways. Neighbors eyed me with curiosity. Some said I was heartless for letting my own son struggle. Others claimed I was selfish, unwilling to step in when he needed me most. The irony was almost unbearable. For decades, I had been accused of doing too much, of being overbearing, of smothering. Now I was accused of doing too little. The weight of judgment pressed heavily on me. My reputation as a teacher, as a mother, as a woman in this small town, all of it felt suddenly fragile. Still, I held my ground. I reminded myself that this was not about appearances, this was about truth. One weekend, there was a family barbecue at David's house. I did not want to go, but avoiding it would only fuel the whispers. So I arrived, standing tall, though my heart pounded in my chest. The backyard buzzed with chatter, children running between tables, the smell of grilled meat filling the air. David stood by the grill, beer in hand, his laughter booming as though the world still belonged to him. Ethan lingered nearby, quieter than usual, his eyes downcast. And then, as conversation swirled, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I could not remain silent any longer. Not in front of these people who thought they knew our story, who thought they could laugh at the napkin without understanding the cost behind it. I stepped forward, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "Do you all want to know the truth?" I asked. Conversation stilled, eyes turned toward me. My heart raced, but I pressed on. "On Christmas Day," I began, "my son gave his father a $30,000 car, and he gave me a napkin calling me the worst mom ever. For years, I paid his rent, his tuition, his car insurance, his credit card silently, so he could feel independent, so he could feel strong. His father gave him laughter and gifts, but I gave him the life he stood on. And when he mocked me, when he erased me, I finally stopped. I stopped paying for his fantasy life. And when reality arrived, his father turned his back. That is the truth." A heavy silence followed, the kind that vibrates in the air. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly. A few even clapped softly, their faces filled with something like respect. For the first time in 20 years, I did not feel crazy. I did not feel erased. I felt understood. And in that moment, standing beneath the string lights of David's backyard, I realized the war I had fought silently for decades was no longer invisible. My voice had finally been heard. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes outside my kitchen window, painting the world in a soft white that belied the storm inside my heart. A week had passed since the barbecue at David's house, and yet I could still feel the echo of my words hanging in the air. The way the crowd had stilled, the way some faces had twisted with discomfort, while others had softened with understanding. It all replayed in my mind like scenes from a film I never thought I would star in. For so many years, my story had been locked away, known only to me. Now it was out in the open, and there was no turning back. On the 7th day after Christmas, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold in my hands. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the heater. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window, slow and unhurried, as though time itself had grown weary. I told myself I was fine, that speaking the truth had set me free. But freedom, I realized, is heavy. It was then that the doorbell rang. The sound startled me, sharp against the stillness. My heart leapt as though it already knew who stood on the other side. When I opened the door, Ethan was there. He looked different, smaller somehow, his pride stripped away. His jacket was rumpled, his cheeks pale from the cold, and his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent too many nights wrestling with himself. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling, "can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He wandered into the kitchen, staring at the table as though it held answers. Finally, he sank into a chair, his hands twisting together nervously. "I miss you," he whispered, almost inaudibly. I didn't realize how much until now. The words should have mended me instantly, but instead, they carved deeper. Because I had longed for them for so many years, and yet hearing them now felt like salt on old wounds. I sat across from him, studying his face. He was still my boy, no matter how old he was, no matter how proud he had once become. "I miss you too," I said quietly. "But Ethan, this isn't about missing each other anymore. This is about what kind of man you want to be." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "I don't know who I am anymore. Dad won't even take my calls. My friends, half of them have disappeared. And you, I treated you like you were nothing. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I just wanted to believe Dad's version of life was easier. But now I see—" His voice cracked, and he covered his face with his hands. "I see how wrong I was." My instinct screamed at me to reach across the table, to hold him, to soothe him like I did when he was a child, crying over scraped knees. But I forced myself to remain still. Boundaries were the hardest form of love, and I had learned too late how necessary they were. "If you want to make things right," I said gently but firmly, "you'll have to stand on your own feet. I can't carry you anymore, Ethan. I won't." His hands dropped from his face, his eyes wide with desperation. "But I don't know how," he whispered. "You'll learn," I replied. "You're stronger than you think, but you have to prove it to yourself. Not to me, not to your father, to you." Silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. Ethan's chest rose and fell as though he were fighting an invisible weight. Finally, he nodded slowly, his gaze lowering. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That night marked a shift. For the first time, Ethan did not leave my house with the expectation that I would fix everything for him. Instead, he left with the burden of his own choices, resting squarely on his shoulders. I watched from the window as he walked away, his figure shrinking against the falling snow. My heart ached, but there was also a strange, quiet pride blooming inside me. The days that followed were not easy. Ethan stumbled often. He found a temporary job delivering pizzas, a humbling contrast to the grand life he once flaunted. He rented a small studio apartment above a noisy pizza shop, where the smell of grease clung to his clothes no matter how often he washed them. He called me occasionally not to ask for money, but to tell me about the little victories. The first paycheck he earned with his own hands. The first time he cooked dinner in a skillet he bought at a thrift store. The way he fixed a leaky faucet by watching tutorials online. Each story was like a fragile bridge being rebuilt between us. And though my instinct still longed to step in, I reminded myself over and over. This was his journey. My role was no longer to pave the path for him, but to stand at the sidelines and cheer as he walked it. There were still moments of tension. Sometimes his voice carried a sharp edge when he called, frustration boiling over as bills piled up, or when loneliness gnawed at him. Old habits die hard, and I could hear in his tone the expectation that I would rush to rescue him. But I stayed firm. "You'll figure it out," I would say gently. "I believe in you." At first, he resisted, but slowly he began to believe those words himself. For me, the turning point was not simply about Ethan learning independence. It was about me learning strength. For decades, I had confused sacrifice with love, silence with devotion. But now, I saw that real love required honesty. Real love sometimes meant standing still while your child stumbled, resisting the urge to cushion their fall. Late one evening, as I sat in my living room with a book in my lap, I found myself thinking of that napkin again. The words, "worst mom ever," still sat in my drawer, tucked away but not forgotten. I realized that in a strange way, those words had freed me. They had forced me to confront the truth I had avoided for so long, that love without respect was not love at all, but slow suffocation. Ethan and I were not healed overnight. The scars remained, reminders of wounds too deep to vanish completely. But for the first time in years, I felt hope. Not the fragile hope that depended on me giving endlessly, but the steady hope that came from watching my son finally stand, shaky but upright, on his own 2 feet. This was no longer about a napkin. It was about a lesson that would shape the rest of his life and mine. It happened on a gray February morning, the kind where the sky looked like it had been painted with ashes, and the air carried a damp heaviness that clung to your skin. I had just finished preparing my lesson plans when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller ID read David. My chest tightened immediately. He almost never called me directly. When he did, it was rarely good. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said cautiously. His voice came through sharp and accusatory. "Mary, what the hell are you doing to our son?" For a moment, I was too stunned to reply. "Excuse me? You've abandoned him," David snapped. "He came to me in tears last week, saying you cut him off, left him out in the cold like some stray dog. Do you have any idea how selfish and cruel that makes you look?" The words pierced me like arrows, but for the first time in years, I did not shrink beneath his anger. Instead, something inside me straightened. My voice came out steady, almost calm. "Selfish? Cruel? I have carried that boy's life on my shoulders for nearly 2 decades, David. I paid his rent, his tuition, his car insurance, his credit cards, all while you played the fun dad, showing up with gifts and stories. Don't you dare lecture me about selfishness." The silence on the line was thick. I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. "You're bitter," he finally spat. "That's your problem. Always have been. You resent me because he loves me more." I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly. "No, David. I resent you because you took the easy path while I bled for him. And now, when the truth finally surfaces, you call me cruel. But you know what? I can live with that, because for once, Ethan is seeing who really stood by him." Before he could respond, I ended the call. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. It was adrenaline. The rush of finally speaking a truth I had buried for too long. But David's words had their effect. He twisted the narrative quickly, as he always had. Within days, whispers began spreading around town. On social media, Ethan posted a vague message. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who turn their back on you. The comments poured in, friends and acquaintances offering sympathy, others wagging their fingers at me without knowing the full story. Some parents at school looked at me differently, their eyes filled with judgment, as though I were the villain in every way David painted me to be. At work, the gossip seeped into the hallways. I overheard 2 colleagues whispering near the teacher's lounge. Can you believe Mary cut off her son like that? After everything? No wonder he's so lost. My chest tightened, but I walked past them without a word. Explaining myself felt useless. People would believe what they wanted to believe. The weight of misjudgment grew heavier each day, pressing down on my shoulders. Even the children seemed to sense something in my demeanor, their innocent questions cutting deeper than they realized. "Miss Mary, are you sad today?" one little girl asked, her wide eyes staring up at me. I forced a smile and shook my head. But inside, I felt like I was unraveling. Then came the family barbecue. Another gathering at David's house. Another stage set for his charm and Lisa's effortless laughter. I debated whether to go at all, but avoiding it would only feed the whispers. So I put on my best coat, painted a calm expression across my face, and stepped into the lion's den. The backyard buzzed with chatter, children chasing each other beneath the glow of string lights. The smell of barbecue filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of Lisa's perfume. David stood near the grill, beer in hand, retelling one of his exaggerated stories, the crowd hanging on every word. Ethan hovered nearby, his posture uncertain, his eyes flickering toward me with a mixture of shame and defiance. I tried to blend into the background, sipping a glass of water, listening to the hum of conversations. But then someone, an uncle of David's, emboldened by drink, called out across the yard. "Hey, Mary, did you really cut Ethan off? Cold-hearted, isn't it, to leave your boy stranded like that?" The words rang out like a challenge, silencing the nearby chatter. Eyes turned toward me, curious, judgmental. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I knew this was the moment. I could either shrink back into silence or finally stand tall. I set down my glass and stepped forward, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "Do you all want to know the truth?" I asked, scanning the crowd. Conversations stilled completely. Even David turned from the grill, his expression tightening. I drew in a deep breath. On Christmas Day, my son gave his father a $30,000 car, and he gave me a napkin calling me the worst mom ever. That was my gift. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but I pressed on. "What none of you knew is that for years I paid his rent, his tuition, his car insurance, his credit cards, all of it. I stayed silent so he could feel independent, so he could believe he was building his own life. Meanwhile, his father gave him laughter and gifts. And when I finally stopped, when I finally let him stand on his own, his father turned his back. That is the truth." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Some faces softened with understanding. Others looked down in shame. A few even applauded quietly, as though recognizing courage when they saw it. For the first time in nearly 20 years, I felt seen. I felt understood. Ethan stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. In that moment, the facade crumbled. The truth, laid bare under string lights and watchful eyes, could not be hidden again. And as I stood there, chest rising and falling with the weight of confession, I realized I was no longer afraid. After that night in David's backyard, my world changed. The truth, once released into the air, could not be gathered back. It lingered like smoke after a fire, clinging to clothes, seeping into conversations, carried on the wind to places I never expected. Some people looked at me differently, with respect and perhaps even admiration. Others turned their backs, choosing to cling to the easier narrative that I was the villain, the mother who had abandoned her son. But I no longer trembled under their judgment. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing firmly on the ground, my voice no longer silenced. Yet the backlash came quickly. Ethan, unable to handle the weight of exposure, turned to social media with a vengeance. One post in particular cut me deeply. "It's a special kind of pain when your own mother betrays you. To the world she pretends to be a saint, but behind closed doors she leaves you to drown." The comments flooded in friends, acquaintances, strangers all rushing to offer him sympathy. Some of them hurled cruel words at me. Words like heartless and toxic. My chest ached as I scrolled through the comments, the screen glowing in the dark of my bedroom. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to correct the lies. But I stopped, because defending myself online would only feed the fire. The truth did not live in posts or comments. It lived in the choices I had made, and in the man my son would become when he finally saw beyond his own pain. Still, the whispers followed me to work. I noticed how colleagues paused their conversations when I entered the lounge, how parents hesitated when they greeted me at school pickup. Even the principal, a kind man who had always trusted me, called me into his office one afternoon. "Mary," he said gently, "I've been hearing things. I know it's not my place, but I want to make sure you're okay." His eyes searched mine, full of cautious sympathy. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," I said. "Just letting my son grow up." He nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in his gaze. My reputation, built over decades of devotion to my students, now felt fragile. And yet, I refused to let shame undo me. The breaking point came at another family gathering, smaller this time, just a handful of relatives around a long wooden table. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with unspoken words. David sat at the head, his expression smug, as though waiting for me to crack under the weight of it all. Lisa leaned close to him, her smile soft, but her eyes sharp, enjoying the spectacle. Ethan sat across from me, his face tight, his hands clenched on the table. Halfway through dinner, David spoke. "You know, Mary," he said, his tone dripping with false pity. "You might think you're teaching Ethan a lesson, but all you're doing is proving what I've said for years. You only care about control. You've always been jealous of the bond he and I share." A murmur rippled around the table. My fork paused midair. For years I had endured his narrative, biting my tongue while he played the hero. But not anymore. I set my fork down, folded my hands calmly, and looked him straight in the eyes. "You're right, David. I did try to control things. I controlled the late fees so Ethan wouldn't lose his apartment. I controlled the tuition bills so he could graduate. I controlled the car insurance so he wouldn't be left stranded. I controlled the credit card balances so he wouldn't drown in debt. I controlled everything, while you controlled nothing except when to show up for the fun." The room went silent. David's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening but no words coming. I turned to Ethan then, my voice softer but no less firm. "You gave your father a $30,000 car because you believed he made you the man you are today. But what has he really given you, Ethan? Stories? Smiles? Empty words when the bills came due? I gave you more than money. I gave you my life. And yes, I stayed silent. I thought love meant carrying it all alone. But silence only made me invisible. Not anymore." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, his jaw tight. He looked between David and me, as if seeing both of us clearly for the first time. The tension broke like glass shattering. Some relatives applauded quietly, nodding their approval. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to choose sides. But I did not care anymore. For the first time, the truth had been spoken without apology. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Ethan lingered behind. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his eyes red. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't know how to undo everything I've said about you. I've been so blind. I didn't want to believe that Dad could let me down. It was easier to blame you." I reached out, resting my hand gently on his arm. "You don't need to undo the past, Ethan. You just need to live differently from now on. Stand on your own feet. Learn who you are, not through your father, not through me, but through yourself." He nodded slowly, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time, I believed he might actually hear me. That night, as I closed the door behind him, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The storm had not passed completely. There would still be whispers, still be scars, but I no longer feared them, because truth once spoken, has a power that no rumor can erase. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was no longer just surviving motherhood. I was finally living it with honesty, with strength, with the kind of love that refused to stay silent any longer. The weeks after that confrontation unfolded slowly, like a long winter finally giving way to hints of spring. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing damp earth and tired grass beneath. My life, too, felt like it was emerging from a season of silence and shadows into something rawer but more honest. For the first time in years, I was no longer carrying secrets. The burden of invisible sacrifice had lifted, replaced by the fragile but undeniable weight of truth. Ethan moved into a small studio apartment above a pizza shop. It was nothing like the sleek, furnished space I had paid for in the past. The walls were uneven, the carpet worn thin, and the smell of melted cheese clung to every corner. Yet it was his first true place. I visited only once, not because I didn't want to be there, but because I wanted him to claim it as his own. The night I stepped inside, he looked nervous, as though ashamed of the simplicity. But I smiled, running my hand along the chipped counter. "It's perfect," I told him, "because it's yours." He flushed, a mix of pride and embarrassment. "I know it's not much, Mom, but I pay for it myself. Every dollar. And that mattered more to me than any polished apartment ever could." Ethan's life began to look different. He worked long hours delivering pizzas, sometimes coming home with grease stains on his shirt and exhaustion in his eyes. But there was a light in him I hadn't seen before. He was learning the rhythm of responsibility, budgeting paychecks, fixing small problems with his own hands, feeling the sting of failure, but also the quiet pride of accomplishment. Occasionally, he would call me just to tell me about something simple. "I made spaghetti tonight, and it actually tasted good." Or, "I figured out how to patch a leak under the sink." To anyone else, those moments might sound trivial, but to me they were monumental. They were signs that he was growing. Our conversations changed, too. They were less about what I could do for him and more about what he was doing for himself. Slowly, cautiously, he began to thank me, not in dramatic gestures, but in small words slipped into conversation. "Thanks for believing I could handle this," he said once, almost shyly. Another time, he admitted, "I don't think I ever understood how hard you worked for me. I get it now." I didn't press him for more. I let those words settle like seeds, trusting they would grow in their own time. One evening, after a long day at school, I stopped by his apartment without telling him. I slipped a small envelope into his mailbox and walked away. Inside was a note I had written carefully, every word weighed. "Proud of you for starting over. Keep going. Mom." I didn't wait for him to call. I didn't expect thanks. But 2 days later, I found an envelope in my own mailbox. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter in Ethan's handwriting, words scrawled unevenly, but filled with honesty. He admitted his mistakes, confessed the blindness of his pride, and finally recognized the sacrifices I had made. "I don't know if I can ever make it up to you, Mom," he wrote, "but I want to try. I want to be the kind of man you can be proud of, not because you saved me, but because I stood on my own." I sat at the kitchen table, tears spilling onto the paper, my heart swelling with something I had not felt in a long time, peace. That night, I went to the drawer where I had kept the napkin. The words, "Worst mom," ever stared back at me, faded slightly with time, but still sharp. For weeks, those words had haunted me, slicing into every memory of sacrifice. But now, as I placed Ethan's letter beside it, something changed. The napkin no longer carried the same sting. It no longer defined me. Instead, it marked the turning point, the moment when silence ended, when truth was spoken, when love transformed from quiet suffering into strength. I realized then that not every story ends with hugs or picture-perfect reunions. Some stories end with scars, with lessons, with growth, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the whispers in town start to fade. Some people still judged me. Of course, that will always be true. But others began to respect the choices I had made. A few even confided in me, admitting that they, too, had carried invisible burdens for their children, afraid to speak of them. I realized my story was not just mine. It was the story of countless mothers who had given everything in silence, only to be misunderstood. At school, I found myself teaching differently too. When children came to me upset about rules or discipline, I spoke with more patience. I told them stories not about Ethan, but about life, about how sometimes love comes disguised as boundaries. I saw their little faces soften, their minds open, and I hoped maybe one day those lessons would carry them through their own storms. Ethan and I are not perfect. We still have distance to cross, trust to rebuild, but the bridge is there now, sturdy and visible, and for the first time, he is walking across it willingly. Not because I built it for him, but because he is choosing to. On quiet nights, when the world feels still, I sometimes sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about the journey we've taken. I think of the little boy who once slipped his hand into mine and promised he would never let go. And though there were years when he did let go, when pride and pain pulled us apart, I now see that love, true love, always finds its way back. Not because it is easy, but because it is strong enough to survive the storms. And as I fold Ethan's letter and place it gently beside the napkin, I whisper to myself, this was never about being the best mom or the worst mom. It was about being the kind of mom who refuses to disappear. That, I realized, was enough. Looking back now, I realize that motherhood is not a simple story of being adored or celebrated. It is a long road, paved with sacrifice, misunderstandings, and choices that are rarely recognized in the moment. For years, I believed that if I carried my son's burdens silently, he would one day look back and see me as a hero. But silence does not always translate to love. Sometimes it translates to invisibility. I learned the hardest lesson a mother can learn, that true love is not about protecting your child from every fall. It is about letting them stumble, even when it breaks your heart to watch. It is about allowing them to face the consequences of their choices, not because you don't care, but because you care too much to keep them weak. For a long time, I wore the label of worst mom ever, like a scarlet letter. It hurt more than I can describe. But with time, I came to understand that sometimes being the villain in your child's eyes is the most powerful act of love you can give, because it means you are strong enough to hold boundaries, even when it costs you their affection in the moment. Love without respect is not love, it is slow torture. Respect is born from truth, from honesty, from the courage to stop hiding behind silence. And as painful as it was, the day I stopped rescuing my son was the day he finally began to see me clearly. If you are listening to this story and it resonates with you, know this: you are not alone. There are countless mothers and fathers who give quietly, who sacrifice without applause, who endure the sting of being misunderstood. But your worth is not measured by recognition. Your worth is measured by the strength you show in teaching your children to stand on their own. And if you have carried the label of too strict, too cold, or even worst, I hope you understand now that sometimes those labels are proof that you were doing the hardest work of all, raising not just a child, but a human being strong enough to face the world. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear it. Because stories of motherhood are not just stories of tears, they are stories of resilience, of boundaries, of strength. And sometimes they are stories of healing. Thank you for listening to mine.